Hey guys, it's Danny. Today we're going to talk a little bit about fertilizers and using fertilizers when it comes to heavy feeding orchids. Now, before everything, I want to start off by saying that I personally do not believe fertilizers are bad. I do get comments from time to time that say, maybe I should start using fertilizer, although I'm against them. And to me, as a person who is not against fertilizers and considers plants, houseplants at least, need addition of fertilizer because they cannot get it naturally, I find it very strange. But if I Google search the subject and how fertilizers can be harmful to humans, I find all sorts of articles, news articles that are very dramatic and instigate this fear and this opposing to fertilizers, when in fact they are referring to totally different things. I'll give you one example so you know where I'm coming from down in the description below. I was responding to a viewer and I did a Google search. The first result that I found was the dangers of fertilizers. And the first phrase of that article, which appears to me like a sort of news article, is something along the lines, fertilizers are just so bad for people because some of them are meant to kill weeds in crops. Now hold on, we've started discussing about fertilizers and then we reached herbicides and furthermore in the article pesticides. Now you can see the problem. Fertilizers are not meant to kill weeds nor pests. They are meant to supplement plants with nutrients. And of course in agriculture, pesticides, herbicides, and all of those things, yes, they are used. And yes, those things are toxic because they're meant to kill something, not to feed something. But I think there's just so much confusion, especially in the press, that everything is put in the same bucket. No, fertilizers are not created to kill something, but to feed plants. So if you are unsure exactly what fertilizers are, what they contain, why they contain those substances, then do a little bit of research and don't read news articles. You can also read some books. You can also ask your biology teacher. So please do that before making an impression that fertilizers are something toxic, are something that should not be used. So with that said, let's get on to fertilizing heavy feeding orchids. Alrighty, so from the beginning when we are starting to learn how to care for orchids, particularly Phalaenopsis orchids, we learned that we should not overfeed orchids. We should not pot them in soil that contains a lot of nutrients, and we should only use fertilizer intended for orchids. And while that is true to some extent, it is easy to go overboard. And I am absolutely guilty with that, and I have some examples to show you. It's easy to go to the other extreme and actually starve the orchids. Because not all orchids are the same, and they're definitely not all light feeders. And while it is true that they do not consume as much as, let's say, tomato, which grows a lot during 1 year or 1 season, some orchids simply need quite a lot more fertilizer than others. And I'm not gonna start with the Catasetums, I'm gonna start with the crowd favorite, the Phalaenopsis. Now, as it just so happens, the Phalaenopsis orchid is not a light feeder. It is actually a heavy feeder. This category is a little bit too generalized in the sense that they might not need as much nutrients as a Catasetum or as a Dendrobium nobile, but they definitely don't need as little as a Miltoniopsis. If you've just started out the hobby, you might not know what I'm talking about, but don't worry, I'll show you further on in this video. So let's take a look at our Phalaenopsis orchids. These are the store-bought Phalaenopsis, the ones you can find anywhere in stores or garden centers. Taking a look at them, we can see there's quite a substantial massive plant here. It's not a very tiny flimsy orchid. The standard size Phalaenopsis can be quite a big plant. Now during the warm season, which is the growing season, this orchid produces quite the large leaves. Let me just show you how large. So this leaf needs to be matured and creating during either the end of spring or summer and autumn. Depending on the climate, they might stop growing in autumn or might start growing sooner or later. In any case, in the warm season, this orchid grows leaves, and not only, it grows roots as well. And the root system is not tiny either. This orchid has a massive roots in the pot, but also you can see the aerial roots. Again, pretty substantial structures. It's not a flimsy root. It is protected by a thick velamen, and depending on the size of the orchid, the root will be thick as well. Not to mention, after the growing season comes the spiking season. Now, all of these structures need nutrients to be created. They don't just appear out of thin air. Luckily for us, Phalaenopsis orchids, like many other orchids, have storage devices. They can store nutrients in their roots and even in their leaves for further use. But if we don't fertilize ever, at some point those resources will be depleted as well. Usually it happens after a massive flowering season. Now, to be able to maintain this orchid at its proper size and creating the proper structures, we need to give it some fuel, and this is fertilizer in our case. And not only nutrients will be used for creating new structures, but they will be used for maintaining and continuing the already present structures, like the older leaves and the older roots, which can branch out or continue to grow. On a Phalaenopsis, roots can get quite massive. So in comparison with other orchids, such as the Phalaenopsis, which have pretty flimsy leaves, as you can see, they're also narrow, they're not as thick. Also, the pseudobulbs are not big, they're not plump, they're actually pretty thin, and the flower spikes, yet again, are not full of flowers, they're not necessarily branching. These orchids don't need as much nutrients as the Phalaenopsis orchids simply due to the structures they have, the size of the structures, and of course the nature of the orchid. So between the Phalaenopsis and the Phalaenopsis, besides cultural needs, there's also a difference in food requirement. Now, if we were to not feed at all next year these orchids, the results might be very, very different next season, next blooming season. And I just happened to go through something like that. At some point in my hobby, I switched to a much weaker fertilizer, which I considered better, and the results were dramatically different. With the very same orchids that I had luscious blooms the previous year, with the change of fertilizer came a change in flower display, in leaf length, in production of roots. Pretty much everything appeared to diminish in size. Now, in the orchid hobby, creating growths that are smaller than the previous ones is never a good thing. The goal is to maintain the orchid with the same size structures or even bigger. So the only way to maintain these structures and to ensure that future structures are big and luscious and fully functional in the future, we need to fertilize Phalaenopsis. Now, in the case of Phalaenopsis, the size of the structures was a good indication of how much food they actually require. But it's not only the size that can give us this indication, it's also the speed of growth. And if you combine big structures with very high speed of growth, well, then you get a massive heavy feeder. And the most massive heavy feeder that I know of and that I own is the Catasetum orchid and the other related subspecies. Now, the Catasetum orchid is a sympodial orchid as opposed to the Phalaenopsis, which is monopodial. This means that it creates pseudobulbs, and each pseudobulb has a set of leaves and a set of roots, and also it creates flower spikes. Now, the creation of a pseudobulb usually lasts around 6 to 9 months. And the size of the pseudobulbs, leaves, and also roots is quite impressive on a healthy and well-fed Catasetum orchid. Now, the one that I'm showing you right now is not a well-fed Catasetum, and this is because, well, it took me a while to figure out how much nutrients they actually need. The result of underfeeding on this orchid is the creation of very tiny structures, and I'll show you a counterexample so you see how this orchid should look like. Now, this orchid was fertilized and fed along with the other orchids and at the same strength as other orchids for the vast majority of time, not necessarily all the time. The result was a non-blooming orchid. This orchid should have bloomed in 2 years already, but also a new growth which is not bigger than the older growth, which is tiny. It's not supposed to be this tiny. Other than that, all the other cultural needs were met as temperature and light goes. In contrast, a well-fed Catasetum should look like this. Now, this is a new orchid to my collection. I purchased it a few months ago. When I unpotted it, I managed to separate these two bulbs, but from this little tiny pseudobulb arose this massive pseudobulb. How is that possible, and why it didn't happen in the case of the other orchid? Well, simple. Nutrients. When I unpotted this orchid, I found a lot of slow-release fertilizer in the older medium. As you can see, I've already added slow-release fertilizer. This is the first year I'm using it. I took the Catasetum growers' advice and actually started to feed a lot more of these orchids, because for a few years, since I have a few Catasetums, I was never able to produce on my Catasetums this big of a structure. And again, all the other cultural needs were met as temperature and light goes, even water requirements. These orchids drink a lot of water. So if you can imagine this structure, which had quite impressive leaves as well and quite an impressive bloom show as well, created 2 flower spikes, all of this was formed and developed during 6 to 9 months. Now, in the world of orchids, this is incredibly fast if we consider the growth speed of Paphiopedilum or even Phalaenopsis orchids. These big structures need support to grow, and that support comes from nutrients. Therefore, this year I decided I will add slow-release fertilizer along with my liquid fertilizer, and we will see the results in autumn. So when determining if an orchid is a heavy feeder or a light feeder, we need to think about the structures. How big they grow, how many other structures do they need to form, and how fast they actually grow. In the case of the Catasetums, we are dealing with very big and impressive structures grown within 6 to 9 months, so a pretty fast time. In the case of Phalaenopsis, we were dealing with structures that are evergreen and continue growing or are maintained throughout the years. Now, there is a little catch with the heavy feeders. In order for them to absorb and benefit from the nutrients you are providing, you need to adjust some other variables as well. And the most important ones are light and temperature. Light regulates the rate of photosynthesis, while temperature regulates the entire metabolism of the orchid. The more light we have, the more rapid photosynthesis will be as well. The warmer it is, the faster the metabolism of the orchid as well. If we are trying to feed an orchid with a big amount of fertilizer and we don't provide adequate light or adequate temperatures, pretty much we're just gonna have a waste of fertilizer, or worse, soil deposits and burned roots. There is a reason why most orchids have their vegetative growth during warmer months, during summer, and this is because the day is longer, the sun is brighter, the temperatures are warmer, and as it just so happens, nutrients are more available, in some regions at least. So that is the time when fertilizing should be the most abundant. If an orchid grows during the cold months, let's say it's a little bit off season, well, you will probably notice that the growths are not as vigorous and as big as in the summertime, and this doesn't necessarily have to do with fertilizer. I'll show you a case, I'll show you a Cattleya which received decent fertilizer. It just so happened that she created a pseudobulb in the winter time, when usually she grows during warmer months and even blooms in the summertime. Since I moved countries, she got a little bit off season, so let me show you how the growth of this winter looks like. So this is one of my oldest orchids. Actually, it's the Cattleya Gold Digger. Now this orchid produces quite large structures. Usually for me, it grows mostly in the warm months and the structures are pretty big. Now this pseudobulb right here was created during winter and you can see it is quite a lot shorter than the other ones. Also, there are no dehydration signs. The pseudobulbs are now wrinkly. There is a little bit of a red tint and this is because light was pretty bright, and also this orchid has roots. I've also tested it for fusarium and she's clean. Also, you can see this cane is really plump. So this orchid actually didn't suffer from lack of food or lack of water or anything of the sort. She actually didn't even suffer from light. What she suffered from was the low temperature. From now on, hopefully she will season herself better to this new climate and will have some better displays, because this is otherwise a pretty vigorous little orchid. So when we are offering fertilizer, and especially for the heavy feeders, we need to adjust light and temperature as well and make sure those nutrients are utilized to the maximum. Now, of course, take this with a grain of salt and refer to the light requirements and temperature requirements of the orchid you are feeding. For example, Phalaenopsis orchids, they don't require bright light, but they do compensate. They create big structures, meaning big leaves, to benefit from as much light as possible. Phalaenopsis orchids are really sensitive to sunlight and they get burned really easily. But even if they are lower light orchids, they should not sit under the desk or in very dark conditions. Bright shade is perfect for them. In the same way with Cattleyas, they do require bright light, but of course it needs to be filtered somehow, especially if temperatures are high, because even Cattleyas and even Vandas and high light orchids can still get sunburned if the sun is very strong and the temperatures are high. Alrighty, so if you've enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you hated it, give it a thumbs down. Subscribe to my channel for daily orchids and plants videos, and also don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a video. And with that said, thank you guys for watching. Stay tuned for the outro because I found footage of my old aquarium. It's about 10 years old, this footage. You know, I always talk about aquariums and make connections with orchids and aquatic plants. Well, planted tanks were my first ever love, and here you go, that's one of my tanks. Enjoy, bye!